Today's reading will be taken from Romans chapter 12, verses 9 to 21. That's Romans chapter 12, verses 14 to 21. Verses 14 to 21. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of the Lord, in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, "It is mine to avenge, I will repay," says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good.
And it's not going to cooperate. Okay. This is going to be one of those days, I can tell it just kind of. I was kind of chuckling with a couple of things that popped out there. One of them, the verses there. And actually, Acts 2:38 was in there twice, in case somebody thought that one was it. But the other one, I'm thinking about, one of my favorite little sayings is the air is human, but to really mess things up, you need a computer. And every now and again, but the other thing I was thinking about, how sometimes something you did in the past is going to come back and haunt you? That first slide with the reading, I did that reading, I saved it a couple of years ago. I have a whole bunch of PowerPoint files of the readings. And I had the file was named right, but the front slide was wrong. And I was thinking, yeah, you make a mistake once and it comes back to haunt you. So, good lesson there. I thought it would be interesting, as we look at different areas and different ideas with some of our lessons. One of the ideas that I try to teach people and often use in counseling is the idea that Christians need to be a people who live on the high ground. Now, what do I mean by that? Okay? Now, if you start looking at the expression high ground, how do we use it? Well, number one, and thinking about, the thoughts from World War I, in warfare, one of the things that armies try to do is they try to conquer the high ground. There's a strategic importance to high ground. It's easier to fight downhill than it is to fight uphill, and so you can defend the high ground. But that's not really what we want to think about. One of the first things that I thought of when we thought about high ground is something you learned in Winnipeg. And that is when there's a flood, you want the high ground. You want to be at that place where, it was interesting when I moved here because I always thought Winnipeg was really flat and learned that Charleswood is like the high place in Winnipeg. I know there's a big hill out by the airport. That's, you're not going to get very many people out. But Charleswood generally tends to be a higher part of the city. I can see everybody now trying to buy a house in Charleswood. But that's, with the flood, that's a good idea. We want to think about it in terms of life. That when we live as Christians, we want to be people who are known for living on the high ground. And as you think about that, look back to Jesus and to his teaching. I think that's really important. There's a moral enigma, and the word enigma, and I thought, maybe I should have used the word puzzle, but an enigma is a puzzle, but sometimes may involve a sense of mystery as well. And there's two things that Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount that just kind of create a bit of a puzzle. On the one hand, Jesus talks about the idea that, he says, don't do what you do to be seen of men. He's especially talking about your gifts of charity, benevolence. And, you think of the fact that there are people that don't know how to be discreet, that they want attention, and that's what he's talking about, the religious leaders of his day who would sound the trumpet. Isn't that interesting? Imagine what would happen if some Sunday morning that we were doing the collection and there's somebody there with a trumpet, kind of blowing the trumpet as they put their money into the collection basket. There's just something really off about that. Jesus says, don't do what you do to help people for recognition. And yet the other part of that is back in chapter 5, where he says, let your light so shine before men that they see your example and glorify your Father who is in heaven. And so that's why I'm kind of referring to it as an enigma or a puzzle, because in some ways it may seem like a bit of a contradiction, but it isn't, because the difference is what is the motivation for what you're doing. And if your motive is attention or recognition for self, then it's wrong. What you're doing, even if you're just doing good, but if it's to get attention, we talk about attention-seeking behavior. Some people want attention. And if that's the reason we're doing it, then Jesus says, don't do it. But if we're doing good so that God will be recognized, in other words, that people understand that this is the characteristic of God's people, then that's what we want. You think about the way Jesus put it, let your light so shine before men, they see your example, and what? Glorify your Father who is in heaven. And so that's why that is really, really critically important. So, Jesus, through his teaching, presents a number of principles for life related to doing good. And I want to go through these. I mean, each one of these could be a sermon. And there are more. But this is kind of hitting some of the highlights. I think I've got 7 or 8 here. All right, in Matthew 6, he talks about, when you're, or Matthew 5, talks about when you're being persecuted. Rejoice. That's an intriguing concept. But it's being so secure in your relationship with God that no matter what happens to you, that can't take away from your relationship with God. That when you suffer, and Peter gets into this later in 1 Peter, that if you suffer for the name of Christ, think of it as a blessing. There's a fascinating idea that weaves through some of these, in that people who are not Christians will see you and will really wonder, why is that person doing that? And that becomes a really important way of showing Jesus to the world around us. He goes on to speak about being salt and of being light. And the way I like to think about it is that there's a subtle influence that salt has. If you have too much salt, it's not so subtle, right? But yet, there are things that if we eat that don't have a little bit of salt in them, they just don't seem right. And you're probably getting hungry right now thinking about what you would like to eat a little bit. It may be something like your eggs in the morning, to eat eggs. We're trying to eat eggs without salt, but it's some morning later they think, oh, I have a little bit of salt, because of the influence of the salt. That's what Jesus talked about, being salt, being light, even referring to the idea of a city set on a hill cannot be hidden in terms of the influence that's being shown by them. Don't resist evil. Human nature is such, and sometimes all you have to do is, I won't pick on any one particular sport, but sometimes all you have to do is watch a sport and you see how people kind of reach a point of conflict where one person is doing, I gotta mention, a friend of mine back in high school, he was not beyond doing a little, and what he would do is that he would, how sometimes basketball players put their hand on the other guy just to let him know that they're there. He would do a little more than that. He'd pinch the guy in the stomach. And it wouldn't be very long before that guy would take a swing at him and would end up with a penalty. The foul in basketball. And that would be a retaliation. And Jesus is saying, no, don't resist evil. When somebody's doing bad to you, don't respond in kind. Don't stoop down to their level. Take the high ground. For many of us, that's a tough thing to do. If somebody's doing something to us, it's very hard to resist. One of the things that I do think is important to understand is that Jesus is not saying that we can't say ouch if somebody hurts us. But decking them, punching them, is not the way that a Christian would respond. So don't resist evil. And then right after that, turn the other cheek. That's a big one. Somebody hits you on one cheek, Jesus says, turn the other. And it's not with a divine, I dare you to do this. But it is with that calm, And one of the things I like to think about with this and talk about is that when we are dealing with people in difficult situations, that we need to understand that if we don't lose our cool, if we don't get angry, guess who gets control of the situation? Because if you respond in kind, if you stoop to that person's level, then they feel justified and they're going to keep it up. So Jesus said, if somebody hits you on the right cheek, turn the other one. Recognize, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of these things, that there is a higher principle that we need to be following. If somebody wants your tunic, now I want you to notice here in Matthew 5:40, because a lot of times people don't really notice one little word in here. If somebody sues you, that's an interesting situation, isn't it? Whether it is, do we not assume that a person being sued has somehow wronged another person? But then yet we also recognize the fact there are people who are by nature very litigious. We see the courts being filled with cases that really are not relevant, or there's really no real basis for the case. But somebody says, well, I think I've been wrong and I have a right to money, or they just want some way to find money and get money. And yet Jesus is talking about somebody sues you for your tunic, give them your cloak too. That's hard, isn't it? Because our reaction is to say, well, that's not right, that's not just, that's not what Jesus is talking about. Jesus is talking about taking a higher road here that actually puts us, as I said, kind of in control of the situation. But it demonstrates that there are other values that we are living for that are not really part of this life or this world. Similarly, right after that, Jesus talks about the second mile. And in those days, and we've talked about this before, a soldier, a Roman soldier, could compel a citizen, a non-soldier, might call it a local, to carry his possessions for a mile. So imagine, because obviously this is not a time when they had cars and most people didn't even have horses or carts or anything else. They'd be just walking along the road. Soldier comes along with his stuff and says, okay, you carry my stuff. And you can just see how many people, in Palestine, how many of the Jewish people would respond to a Roman, saying, okay, I'm going to do two things. Number one, I'm going to carry it to the very least that I can get away with. And number two, I'm going to make your life miserable while I'm doing it. And I'm going to be muttering and complaining. And Jesus says, now hold on. This guy compels you to carry his things 1 mile. Go ahead and take it a second mile. Really messes mind up. I kind of jokingly, when I think about that, I think about what that Roman soldier would be thinking if these people are willingly carrying these things for it. And I'd like to think sometimes they did a second mile and a third mile and a fourth mile. And what's he up to? And then Jesus talks about forgiveness when he introduces the model of prayer. This is the Lord's Prayer. I came across an interesting book about a month ago, and I thought it was a really interesting idea. He said, forgiveness is what one person does to another. Reconciliation is what two people do. Intriguing. That when Jesus tells us to forgive, it's unconditional. We forgive those who wrong us. Whether that person knows they wronged us or intended to wrong us, that the high ground is forgiving, regardless. Wow. So, the challenge, I think, is kind of identified over in Romans 12, which is, which was our reading. So Paul says, and you can hear the echo of Jesus' teaching, bless those who persecute you. He is not thinking about, movie Sister Act. Y'all remember Sister Act? And at the end of the movie, where Oda Mae is going to tell off the mafia guy, the criminal, and the nuns are there kind of go, oh, no. Because you can just see that Oda Mae is about to say something that she shouldn't say. And she looks at him and says, bless you. And you kind of understand that the words may be bless you, but the thought is not. That's not what Paul or Jesus has in mind. Bless those. Treat favorably. That's the whole point that we look at through those passages from the Sermon on the Mount. Treat them favorably. Treat them decently. Treat them honorably. Treat them fairly. Even if they're not treating you fairly, treat them fairly. Paul says, do not repay evil for evil. That's almost echoing what Jesus has said. You know, we have this idea that somehow we are justified in giving back what they've given to us. What did Jesus say in the Sermon on the Mount? Do to others as you have to do to you. We call that the golden rule. Why? Because it's exceptional for us as human beings. So, do not repay evil for evil. The third one, do not take revenge. Sometimes we think, well, maybe a little bit. And you know, some of you know me well enough to know that I'm capable of dreaming of all kinds of mischief to get into. But what Paul is talking about, what Jesus is talking about is, you know, and in fact, Paul puts it very, very bluntly, that God says it is mine to avenge. We do not want to presume upon the role or the position of God in this. So, living on higher ground. Now, we're just going to talk about a few things here and we'll wrap up. Okay, number one, we need a mind focused on Christ. You know, Paul tells the Ephesians, you know, that you know, keep putting your mind on Christ, you know, on heaven, where Christ is. That part of the problem is we get stuck in the trenches and we get stuck in the behavior that other people are going through. And we get focused on our little pity party about how somebody's treated us. But it doesn't change the fact that God has called us to live on higher ground. To be different from the world. To live in such a way, and you know, Peter talks about this idea, and I think it's really interesting, where you know, he's talking about not just the retaliatory and the, you know, when other people treat us badly, but also Peter's talking about where the other people around us are living in moral wrong. And because we take the high ground, we say, no, I'm not going to do that. And Peter said they will wonder why we don't participate with their excess. Why? Because we're trying to follow the high ground. You know, the moral high ground, I think, is one of those things for us as Christians, it's critical. You know, we live in a world where indecency is running amok, where sin is being flaunted in front of us all of the time. And for the Christian who's called to live on the high ground, you know, it becomes critical for us to maintain our standards. Not just because we think we're living a bunch of rules, but because we want to be like God. We want to be like Jesus. Secondly, is to understand that anger can be controlled. You know, I think back to when I was young and I blew my top very easily. I had a runaway anger, and you know, and I don't know. Somehow I learned the idea that, you know, you don't have to explode. You don't have to be angry. It's our pride. You know, and Paul, look back through these verses. Look at how much Paul says about pride here. It's because we count ourselves better than other people. And so one thing I want to just make the point here, that living on the high ground does not mean that I feel superior to people around me. Living on the high ground means that I'm trying to be like Jesus. Which means I'm living in humility and love. So walk in others' shoes. Now that's one of the things that as you look at what Paul is talking about, you know, about compassion, rejoicing with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. You know, that is being empathetic, being genuinely concerned, forgetting you know, one of the biggest problems people have in our culture today is they are wrapped up in themselves. and their entitlements. The high ground is a way that seeks to serve and to help and to bless other people. And somebody says, but they don't deserve it. Exactly. The world didn't deserve Jesus and his death. But that's what God did for us. And then in this is one of those verses that is just do right. Do what is right in everyone's eyes. Is he saying to be totally controlled by public opinion? No, that's not what he's talking about. You know, if you think about that, you'll go crazy. But it's the high ground, the moral, personal high ground. Doing what is unquestionably right. Living with moral excellence. That's what Peter, when he talks about the virtues that, you know, add to your faith, virtue, moral excellence. So what people see in us is quality of character. That's part of quality of life. Be a peacemaker. Live, you know, and I love the expression, so far as it depends on you, live at peace with all men. That recognizes sometimes we can't control what other people say and do. We can't do that. We can't make anybody do what we want them to do. In fact, you know, that's the quickest way to stir up trouble. You know, imagine if somebody was just kind of watching over your shoulder and, you know, making comments about what you were doing. Oh, no, don't think I would do that. How long is it going to be before you get really annoyed? And sometimes there are some people that are just not going to like the way the Christians live and the way the Christians think and what Christians do. But we don't go out to try to stir up trouble. We don't go out to try to put people on the spot. We do the high ground in what we live and what we say. But the interesting thing about this is that as Paul makes the point, I think I just lost my sound. As Paul makes the point that we will confuse those who are looking at us and watching us, that he talks about being kind to our enemies, and in so doing, you will heap coals of fire on their heads. Isn't that an amazing thing? Why? Because that's your way of getting even? No, that's not your motive. Your motive is to take the high ground. But in taking the high ground, you are doing something that will confuse those who don't know what it is to be Christian and don't know how we live. That's what will set God's people apart from the world around them. But they are people of the high ground. Okay, we need to finish. Glenn's chosen a song for us to close with. One of our favorite songs, Higher Ground. And let's stand as we sing.